On a Tuesday night in a small town in Ohio, a woman named Melissa Turner sat on the edge of a borrowed bed in her sister's spare room, folding laundry that wasn't even hers, because folding laundry was the only thing left in her life that still made sense. She had $11 in her checking account. She had a phone full of unanswered messages from a man she used to call her husband. And she had, tucked inside the pocket of an old coat she almost didn't bring with her when she was thrown out of her own home, a single lottery ticket she had bought out of habit, not hope. She did not know it yet, but in exactly 9 days, her name would be read out loud on live television, and the man who told her she would never survive without him would be watching from a bar 3 miles away, unable to breathe. This is the story of how Melissa Turner lost everything in 1 month, and then, in the next month, became one of the wealthiest women in the United States. Stay with us, because what happens in between is something almost nobody saw coming, including Melissa herself. To understand how Melissa Turner ended up sitting in that spare room with $11 to her name, you have to go back to the marriage that everyone in her town believed was solid. Craig Turner and Melissa had been married for 18 years. On the outside, they looked like the couple other couples envied. A stable house, 2 kids doing well in school, a husband who owned a growing construction company. But behind the version of Craig Turner that his neighbors and his customers saw, there was another version. One that Melissa alone was starting to notice in the year before everything fell apart. There are 3 questions this story is going to answer for you. Why did Craig Turner really throw his wife out of their home? What did Melissa do in the 4 weeks that followed, when she had almost nothing left?
And what did she choose to do with $850 million once she finally had more power than the man who tried to erase her? The answers are not what you expect, and some of them will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Melissa grew up in a small house outside Dayton, Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters raised mostly by her mother after her father, Harold Voss, chose his career over his family and left when Melissa was 9 years old. Her older sister Diane Whitfield became the steady one, the one who stayed close to home, while Melissa was the daughter who dreamed bigger, who wanted to study design and build something of her own someday. She met Craig Turner at 23, when he was a young contractor with more ambition than money, working long hours to build a small construction business from nothing. Melissa believed in him before almost anyone else did. She took a job at a local diner to help cover their bills in the early years, and she quietly gave up her own plans to study design so that Craig's company could grow first, telling herself there would be time for her dreams later, once things were stable. For a while, it seemed to be working exactly the way she hoped. They had 2 children together, Ava and Ben, and for over a decade, the Turner household looked, from the outside, like a family that had made it. Craig's company grew from a 2-man operation into a business with contracts across 3 counties. Melissa managed the house, raised the kids, and kept working part-time at the diner alongside her best friend, a woman named Nicole Park, who had known Melissa since they were teenagers and who would later become one of the only people Melissa trusted with the truth about what was really happening inside her marriage. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. But in the 18th year of their marriage, small things started to shift in ways that Melissa noticed but did not yet want to name. Craig began staying later at job sites. He joined a gym he had never mentioned before. He started taking phone calls in the garage with the door shut, something he had never done in all the years before. Before we go any further into what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Melissa told herself the changes in Craig were nothing more than the pressure of running a growing business. She had watched him build that company from almost nothing, and she knew stress could make a man distant without it meaning anything darker was happening underneath. Their daughter Ava, 16 at the time, was the first to notice something her mother had not yet let herself see. Ava mentioned once, almost in passing, that she had seen her father's truck parked outside a restaurant on the edge of town on a night he said he was working late. Melissa brushed it off in front of her daughter, telling her that business dinners happened all the time in Craig's line of work. But that night, after the kids were asleep, she sat awake longer than usual, turning the comment over in her mind, aware that a small, uncomfortable feeling had settled into her chest that she could not quite explain away. Around this same time, Craig's company hired a new office manager named Renee Castillo, 34 years old, sharp, organized, and quickly indispensable to the day-to-day running of the business. Melissa met her only twice, briefly, at a company event and once when she stopped by Craig's office to drop off paperwork. Renee was polite, professional, and gave Melissa no obvious reason for concern. But Craig began mentioning her name more often at the dinner table, always in the context of work, always framed as nothing more than an efficient employee who had made his life easier. Looking back, Melissa would later say that it was not any single comment that alarmed her. It was the accumulation of small shifts, the way Craig's phone began facing screen down on the counter, the way he grew irritated when she asked simple questions about his schedule, the way affection between them had quietly thinned without either of them naming it out loud. The moment that finally cracked things open came on an ordinary Thursday evening in late spring. Melissa was folding laundry in their bedroom when Craig's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and a message preview appeared on the screen from a contact saved simply as R. The message referenced a hotel and a time, nothing more, but it was enough. Melissa did not confront him that night. Instead, she quietly researched the name of the hotel over the following days, found an old receipt tucked into the side pocket of Craig's truck a week later, and slowly assembled a picture she had spent months refusing to look at directly. She did not tell her sister Diane right away. She did not tell Nicole at the diner. For nearly 3 weeks, Melissa carried the knowledge alone, trying to decide what kind of conversation she wanted to have, and whether the marriage she had spent 18 years building was already over before she said a single word about it. The confrontation did not happen the way Melissa had imagined it. She had pictured a quiet conversation, late at night, after the children were asleep, where she would lay out what she knew and give Craig the chance to explain himself. Instead, it happened on a Saturday afternoon, when Craig came home earlier than expected and found Melissa sitting at the kitchen table with the hotel receipt placed deliberately in front of her. There was no slow build to what followed. Craig did not deny it. He did not apologize either. Instead, in a tone Melissa had never heard him use before, he told her that he had been seeing Renee Castillo for 8 months, that he had already made his decision, and that he wanted Melissa out of the house within 48 hours so that Renee could move in. He reminded her, coldly, that the house was in his name alone, a detail from years earlier that Melissa had never thought would matter, back when they were young and had no reason to distrust each other. Ava and Ben overheard most of the conversation from the hallway, and their reactions split in different directions almost immediately. Ben, only 12, grew angry and withdrawn, unable to understand how his father could do this to his mother, and unwilling to speak to Craig for days afterward. Ava, at 16, was quieter about it, but she was the one who helped her mother carry boxes to the car 2 days later, the one who said almost nothing but stayed close to Melissa's side the entire time, as if she understood, even at 16, that her mother needed someone simply standing beside her. Craig, for his part, avoided the house during the actual move, later telling friends that it was easier for everyone if he wasn't there for what he called an unnecessarily emotional exit. Melissa would later describe that 48-hour window as the longest 2 days of her life, packing 18 years into cardboard boxes while trying to explain to her children why their family no longer looked the way it had the week before. As Melissa loaded the last box into her car, her sister Diane Whitfield pulled into the driveway to help her move her things into the spare room of her own home. Diane hugged her sister tightly in the driveway, and it was there, standing in front of the house she would never live in again, that Melissa said the only thing she would allow herself to say out loud that day. She told Diane, quietly, that she wasn't finished, that this was not the end of her story, though at that moment she had no idea what those words would come to mean. Nobody standing in that driveway that afternoon, not Melissa, not Diane, not even Craig watching from a distance through the front window, could have predicted that in exactly 30 days, Melissa Turner's name would be broadcast across every local news channel in the state, and that the life she had just been forced to leave behind would look almost nothing like the one waiting for her on the other side. Before we go any further into what Melissa did next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The spare room in Diane Whitfield's house was small, barely large enough for the bed and a dresser, but Melissa told herself every night that it was temporary, a place to land while she figured out what came next. Diane never once made her sister feel like a burden. She rearranged her own schedule to help with Ava and Ben when they came to stay on the weekends Craig didn't have them, and she quietly covered small expenses without ever mentioning it, the kind of support that Melissa would only fully appreciate months later, once she had the perspective to look back on it. Melissa picked up extra shifts at the diner where she had worked on and off for years alongside her closest friend, Nicole Park. Nicole did not ask many questions in those first few days. She simply made sure Melissa always had a shift when she needed one, and she kept a booth in the corner open for her on the mornings Melissa needed somewhere quiet to sit before her shift began. Money became the loudest problem almost immediately. Melissa had access to a joint account that Craig froze within days of her leaving, a move his lawyer would later frame as a routine step in separating shared finances, but one that left Melissa without access to funds she had helped earn over 18 years of marriage. She could not yet afford a lawyer of her own, and the one consultation she managed to schedule ended with a retainer fee she had no way to pay. Craig's attorney began sending formal letters within the first 2 weeks, each one methodical, each one making clear that the house, the primary accounts, and the bulk of the business assets were positioned to remain in Craig's name. Melissa read each letter standing at Diane's kitchen counter, folding them carefully back into their envelopes, refusing to let her children see how frightened she actually was underneath the calm she worked hard to maintain in front of them. Word reached Melissa through Ben, 12 years old and still openly angry at his father, that Renee Castillo had moved into the house within 2 weeks of Melissa leaving, far sooner than Melissa had expected. Ben described it in the blunt, unfiltered way only a 12-year-old can, telling his mother that Renee had already rearranged the kitchen and that his father seemed happier than Ben had seen him in years, a detail that landed harder than Ben likely realized it would. Ava, at 16, handled the transition more quietly, splitting her time evenly between her mother's spare room and her father's house without complaint, though she began spending noticeably less time at Craig's, often finding reasons to stay with her mother and aunt instead. One afternoon, Ava mentioned to Melissa, almost too casually, that she had seen Renee wearing a ring that used to belong to Melissa's grandmother, a family heirloom Melissa believed had been packed away in storage. Melissa said nothing in front of her daughter, but that detail stayed with her for days afterward, a small, specific cruelty she had not expected. Around the same time, Melissa received an unexpected phone call from her father, Harold Voss, a man she had not spoken to in nearly 6 years. Harold had heard through a distant relative about the separation and called under the guise of checking in, though the conversation quickly turned toward his own circumstances, hinting at financial difficulties of his own and asking, indirectly, whether Melissa might be in a position to help once her situation stabilized. Melissa kept the call short, polite but guarded, unwilling to let old wounds reopen on top of everything else she was carrying. She did not mention the call to Diane for several days, and when she finally did, Diane's only response was a raised eyebrow and a quiet reminder that their father had a long history of appearing exactly when it benefited him most. On the 22nd night since she had left the house on Maple Ridge Road, Melissa stopped at the gas station 2 blocks from the diner after closing, the same station she had passed 1,000 times over the years without a second thought. Her mother, years earlier, had always bought a single lottery ticket on Friday nights, calling it a small ritual rather than a real hope of winning, something to mark the end of a long week rather than a genuine expectation of a different life. Melissa found herself standing at the counter that night almost without deciding to, reaching for a single ticket the way her mother used to, more out of exhausted habit than any real belief that it would change anything. She paid for it with loose change from the bottom of her purse, tucked it into the pocket of an old coat without much thought, and drove back to Diane's house thinking about nothing more than getting a few hours of sleep before her early shift the next morning. She did not check the numbers that night, or the next morning, or even the day after that. The ticket sat forgotten in her coat pocket for nearly a week while Melissa focused on the more immediate pressures in front of her, the mounting legal letters, the children's shifting schedules, the exhausting rhythm of diner shifts stacked back to back. It was Nicole, of all people, who finally noticed the winning numbers posted behind the counter of the gas station on her own way to work one morning, numbers that seemed to match a conversation she vaguely remembered having with Melissa days earlier about the ticket sitting untouched in her coat. Nicole called Melissa before her shift even started, her voice shaking in a way Melissa had never heard from her before, telling her to check her coat pocket immediately and to sit down before she did it. Before we go any further into what Melissa found in that coat pocket, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Melissa stood in Diane's kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, Nicole's voice still shaking on the other end, and pulled the ticket out of her coat pocket with hands that were not entirely steady. She read the numbers once, then again, then a third time, certain she had made some kind of mistake, certain that a woman who owned $11 and a borrowed bed could not possibly be holding a ticket worth more money than she could fully picture in her mind. Diane came into the kitchen mid-search, drawn by the strange tone in her sister's voice, and found Melissa sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets, the ticket held out in front of her like something that might disappear if she looked away from it. Neither sister said much of anything for a long moment. Then Diane took the ticket, checked the numbers herself against the announcement on her own phone, and said only one word, quietly, as if speaking too loudly might undo it. The two of them sat on that kitchen floor for nearly an hour, not celebrating exactly, more stunned into a kind of careful silence, both aware that a piece of paper this small was about to change everything, and neither entirely sure yet what that meant. Melissa's first instinct was not joy. It was fear, a sharp, immediate fear that something this large could be taken from her the way so much else already had been in the past month. She called the state lottery hotline that same night, her voice unsteady as she asked question after question about what she needed to do next, how the money could be protected, and whether there was any risk of losing the ticket before it could be officially claimed. The person on the other end of the line, used to calming down winners in far less dramatic circumstances than Melissa's, walked her through the basic steps, and for the first time in weeks, Melissa allowed herself to feel something close to relief. Melissa made a decision that night that she would keep for the next 9 days. She told no one beyond Diane and Nicole, not her children, not her co-workers at the diner, and certainly not. She had heard enough stories over the years about lottery winners losing everything within a year, about families torn apart by sudden money, and she was determined not to let that happen to her, especially not while her divorce from Craig was still unresolved and his lawyer was still sending letters about what remained of the marital assets. On Nicole's recommendation, Melissa met quietly with a financial attorney 2 towns over, someone with no connection to Craig's legal team, who explained to her, carefully and in plain language, that under state law, any winnings from a ticket purchased after her separation from Craig would very likely be considered her separate property, not something Craig could lay any claim to during the divorce proceedings. The 9 days were not without their own tension. 3 days after the win, the lottery office flagged the ticket for a routine verification check after a small tear was discovered along one edge, folded from weeks spent in Melissa's coat pocket, and for nearly 48 hours, Melissa did not know whether the ticket would be on it at all. She barely slept during that window, working her diner shifts as if nothing had changed, smiling at customers while quietly terrified that the largest moment of her life might unravel over a piece of damaged paper. The lottery office ultimately confirmed the ticket was valid, the tear cosmetic rather than compromising, and Melissa was cleared to move forward with the claim. Through all of this, Craig remained completely unaware, continuing his life on Maple Ridge Road with Renee, telling co-workers at his company that Melissa would, in his words, land on her feet eventually, unaware of exactly how true that sentence was about to become. While Melissa navigated attorneys and verification calls in near total secrecy, Craig and Renee were moving forward with plans of their own. Renee had begun quietly researching venues for a wedding, telling friends at Craig's company that they were hoping for something small but elegant later that year, a detail that would circulate through the same small town where Melissa still worked her diner shifts. Craig, for his part, seemed to those around him more settled than he had been in months, confident that the difficult part of his life, the part involving Melissa, was now firmly behind him. He mentioned to a business associate, almost offhand, that he expected the divorce to finalize quickly and cleanly, certain that Melissa had neither the resources nor the will to contest much of anything. It was a confidence built on an assumption that would not survive the following week. The Lottery Commission scheduled Melissa's official claim ceremony for a Thursday morning, informing her that, per standard procedure for a prize of this size, the announcement would be covered by local television news, a detail Melissa had not fully considered until it was already set in motion. She realized, sitting in Diane's kitchen the night before the ceremony, that within 24 hours, her name and her face would be broadcast across every screen in the town she had lived in for 18 years, including, almost certainly, the screen of whatever bar or living room Craig happened to be standing in front of when it aired. She told her children the truth for the first time that night, sitting them down at Diane's small kitchen table, watching Ben's disbelief slowly turn into something like joy, and watching Ava go quiet in the particular way she did whenever something mattered to her too much to say out loud right away. Before we go any further into the morning that changed everything, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Melissa woke before her alarm on the morning of the claim ceremony, lying still in the small spare room for several minutes before she allowed herself to get up, aware that the next few hours would change the shape of her life permanently. Diane drove her to the lottery office, both sisters mostly quiet in the car, though Diane reached over at one point and squeezed Melissa's hand without saying anything, a gesture that said more than words could have in that moment. Nicole met them in the parking lot, having arranged for someone else to cover her shift at the diner so she could be there, unwilling to let Melissa walk into that building without someone beside her who had known her since long before any of this began. Ava and Ben waited at Diane's house with instructions to watch the noon broadcast together, Melissa unable to bring herself to have them present in person for the cameras, wanting to protect them from the attention for as long as she reasonably could. Inside the lottery office, the process itself was almost strangely ordinary: paperwork, verification, quiet conversations with officials who handled enormous sums of money as routinely as Melissa once handled orders at the diner. The number itself, $850 million before taxes, was read aloud to her plainly, without ceremony, and Melissa found herself gripping the edge of the table as she heard it spoken in a room full of strangers for the first time. A small local news crew had been granted access to film the announcement portion of the ceremony, standard practice for a prize of this size, and Melissa stood in front of the camera when the moment came, her hands folded in front of her, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, as she confirmed her name for the broadcast that would air across the region at noon. At exactly noon, the segment aired across every local news affiliate in the region, cutting into regular programming with the kind of urgency reserved for major regional stories. Melissa's face appeared on screen, her name displayed clearly beneath it, along with the amount that had, by that point, already begun spreading through group chats and phone calls across the town faster than the broadcast itself could travel. In a bar on the other side of town, a place Craig had taken to visiting most afternoons since the divorce proceedings began, several televisions mounted along the wall were tuned to the same local news channel out of habit rather than intention. Craig was sitting with two co-workers when the segment began, mid-conversation about something unrelated, and it was one of those co-workers who noticed first, going quiet mid-sentence and nodding toward the screen without immediately finding the words to explain why. Craig turned toward the television in time to see Melissa's face fill the screen, her name printed beneath her, the number beside it rendering the rest of the bar momentarily background noise to him. Witnesses in the bar that afternoon would later describe Craig going completely still, his drink untouched in front of him, staring at the screen as though waiting for it to correct itself. One of his co-workers asked if that was really his ex-wife, and Craig did not answer right away, the silence stretching long enough that people at nearby tables began to notice. Renee, informed of the broadcast by a friend within minutes, called Craig's phone 4 times in the span of 10 minutes before he finally answered, his voice, according to the co-worker who was still sitting beside him, sounding unlike anything either of them had heard from him before. In the days that followed the broadcast, as news of Melissa's win spread beyond the local region and into wider coverage, a detail surfaced that Craig himself had entirely forgotten about, buried in paperwork from years earlier when the business was first structured. During the early years of Craig's construction company, back when Melissa was still working the diner to help cover their bills, an accountant had listed Melissa as a minor co-owner on certain foundational documents, a decision made at the time simply to satisfy a lending requirement, never intended by either of them to carry any real weight going forward. Craig's legal team, reviewing the divorce filings in light of Melissa's sudden change in circumstances, discovered that this old paperwork technically entitled Melissa to a small but legally significant stake in the company Craig had spent years believing was entirely his own, a complication that had nothing to do with the lottery winnings themselves but arrived at the worst possible moment for Craig regardless. The lottery attorney Melissa had quietly retained weeks earlier confirmed what she had already been told, that the $850 million itself, won on a ticket purchased after her separation from Craig, belonged to her alone under state law, entirely outside the reach of the ongoing divorce proceedings. Craig's attorney, in a final and somewhat desperate filing, attempted to argue that the timing of the win and the circumstances of the separation should entitle Craig to some portion of the winnings, an argument that legal analysts covering the story publicly described as almost certain to fail given how clearly the law treated post-separation earnings. For Ava and Ben, the days following the broadcast were a blur of phone calls, reporters occasionally reaching out through social media, and a strange, disorienting shift in how their classmates and neighbors began treating their family, though both children, in their own ways, seemed far more focused on their mother than on the money itself. Before we go any further into what happened between Melissa and Craig once the dust began to settle, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the weeks following the broadcast, the relationship between Craig and Renee Castillo began to change in ways that were subtle at first and then increasingly difficult to ignore. Friends close to the couple would later describe a shift in Renee's demeanor almost immediately after the news spread, a growing distance that Craig initially attributed to the stress of the ongoing legal complications with Melissa. The wedding venue Renee had been quietly researching for months was never booked. When a mutual friend asked her directly about the wedding timeline at a gathering several weeks later, Renee reportedly changed the subject quickly, and within the month, co-workers at Craig's company noticed she had stopped wearing the ring altogether. The company itself, still tangled in the legal questions raised by the old ownership paperwork, was under more financial strain than it had faced in years, and Craig, once seen around town as confident and settled, began appearing, according to several people who knew him, noticeably worn down by circumstances he had never anticipated having to navigate. By late summer, Renee had moved out of the house on Maple Ridge Road entirely, telling a small circle of friends that she had not expected the relationship to come with this much complication, and that she had begun to see a side of Craig's situation she had not fully understood when it began. Craig, now facing a legal battle over his own company, a broken engagement, and a public spotlight he had never wanted, found himself, for the first time since the separation, without the certainty that had defined his decisions a few months earlier. Neighbors describe him as quieter, less visible around town, no longer the man who had once told coworkers that Melissa would land on her feet eventually while he moved forward untouched. The story that had once seemed, from Craig's side, like a clean and simple new beginning had instead become the most difficult chapter of his adult life. The first attempt at contact came through Ava, who mentioned to her mother one evening that her father had asked, carefully, how Melissa was doing, and whether she thought Melissa might be open to talking at some point. Melissa did not respond right away. She had spent the past several weeks focused almost entirely on stabilizing her children's lives, working with her attorney to finalize the terms of the divorce, and beginning, slowly, to imagine what her own life might look like now that money was no longer the constant, grinding pressure it had been for 18 years. When Craig finally reached out directly, several weeks later, it was through a brief, carefully worded text message, asking if they could meet in person to talk, not about the money, he clarified, but about everything else. Melissa agreed to meet him once, at a coffee shop 2 towns away from where either of them lived, wanting neutral ground and no possibility of being observed by anyone from their old life together. Craig arrived first, and according to Melissa's account to Diane afterward, he looked smaller somehow than she remembered him, less certain of himself than the man who had once given her 48 hours to leave her own home. He apologized, at length, for the way he had handled the separation, for the coldness of that Saturday afternoon in the kitchen, and for underestimating what she was capable of once she was on her own. Melissa listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him directly whether he would be saying any of this if the lottery numbers had never come in her favor. Craig did not have an answer ready, and the silence that followed told Melissa everything she still needed to know. Around the same time, Harold Voss resurfaced a second time, this attempt considerably less subtle than his first phone call months earlier. He reached out directly to Ava, using his granddaughter as an entry point back into Melissa's life, sending messages that framed himself as a grandfather eager to reconnect, though the timing, arriving only weeks after the broadcast made Melissa's new circumstances public knowledge, was not lost on either Melissa or Diane. Diane, still protective of her sister in the same steady way she had been since the night Melissa first moved into her spare room, urged Melissa to be cautious, reminding her of the pattern their father had shown throughout both of their lives, present only when circumstances made his presence convenient. Melissa ultimately responded to Harold with a brief, polite message, thanking him for reaching out but declining any further contact for the time being, a boundary she set calmly and without the anger she might once have felt entitled to. In the months that followed, Melissa made a series of decisions that would come to define this new chapter of her life far more than the number itself ever could. She used a portion of the winnings to buy Diane a home of her own, a quiet way of returning even a fraction of the support her sister had given her without hesitation during the hardest weeks of her life. She established trusts for Ava and Ben, structured deliberately so that the funds would remain entirely outside Craig's reach regardless of anything that happened between the two adults going forward. She helped Nicole open a small business of her own, something Nicole had talked about for years but never had the resources to pursue. As for Craig, Melissa's answer, when it finally came, was not delivered with anger or with any interest in punishing him further than circumstances already had. She told him, simply, that she wished him well, that she held no interest in reconciliation, and that the life she was building now belonged entirely to her, in a way nothing before ever fully had. It was not the ending anyone watching from the outside might have expected. No dramatic confrontation, no triumphant declaration, only a woman who had finally, quietly, become fully her own. Before we close out this story, ask yourself honestly whether you would have noticed the signs Melissa missed, and whether you believe Craig's regret was genuine or simply a reaction to circumstances he never saw coming. Melissa Turner's story is a reminder that the people who count us out the fastest are often the ones least prepared for what we are capable of once we are finally free to build something on our own terms. She did not set out for revenge, and in the end, she never needed it. The life she built afterward, for herself, for Ava and Ben, for Diane, and for Nicole, spoke for itself far louder than anything she could have said to Craig directly. We would love to know what you took away from this one. Do you think Craig's regret was real, or only a reaction to money he could no longer touch? Would you have spotted the signs Melissa missed in those final months of her marriage, or do the quiet ones always catch us the most off guard? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would love to hear your take on this story. If this story kept you watching until the very end, we have another one waiting for you that we think you are going to want to see next, a story about a family that thought they had buried their worst secret for good, until one phone call brought all of it back to the surface. Make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on so you never miss the next one the moment it goes live. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next story.